Today we're going to continue our discussion on transitioning to Angular 2, and we're actually going to build our first Angular 2 app. Previously, we took John Papa's Hot Towel Starter project and we refactored that to use a component-based design. We moved logic out of controllers and into directives, and then we later converted that into a TypeScript Angular 1 application. And all this was done in preparation for making this move to Angular 2. So today we're going to look at that same application but implemented in Angular 2. And we're going to step through some of it and see the basics of how to construct an Angular 2 application. So to recap, Angular 2 is a complete rewrite of AngularJS. It doesn't have controllers, it doesn't have scopes. An application is just a component tree, so each component knows about its child component, so there's no registering modules with Angular. And the code base itself is written in TypeScript for Angular. And Angular 2 has excellent support for TypeScript because of that, and we highly recommend using TypeScript when building an Angular 2 app. And again, at the time of this recording, Angular 2 is an alpha product, and many of the features are still in development. So we are going to stay away from some of the services and stuff that Angular 2 provides since they're still being changed, and we'll just start with the basics today. So previously we showed this TypeScript Angular 1.x example. It's very simple, very basic. There's a service, a controller, a directive. The controller injects the service to populate data that then gets rendered within the directive. And all these components are registered with Angular. So this same application in Angular 2 looks like this. We just declare a class, myService, has the function that we expect, mark it as injectable, and then we have our app component, our root component that represents the application itself. The selector for that to place it in the HTML is myApp. And the view that will get rendered is that simple template right there. And so we inject the service simply by saying that we want an instance of myService, and it just works. So it's very basic, very simple, not registering components, you're not doing a lot of scaffolding. So today we're going to look at an Angular 2 application. So if you want to do a comparison, you can take a look at the TypeScript version of this app that we'll be looking at today. There's the URL for it, and there is the URL for the new one that we'll be stepping through. Specifically today, we're going to look at how to bootstrap an Angular 2 application, how to set up some basic routing, what that component tree looks like, and then some simple transclusion. So loading an Angular 2 app in a page is a little bit different than Angular 1. Angular 1, most of you have probably used ng-app in your HTML to actually specify which app you want to load. And now in Angular 2, since we're just loading a component that may have child components, we do it a little bit differently. And let's take a quick look at what that looks like. So, all right, let's go back into client source app.ts. So here we're actually bootstrapping the Hello World app component, which is the root component for our application. As you can see, we're pulling it in from components, Hello World component, and we're saying that this is the actual root component, and these are the dependencies that we have. So the index.html right here, as you can see, there's no ng-app or anything like that. We're using system.js to pull in all of our JavaScript files, all of our compiled TypeScript JavaScript files, and then we simply have our root component just injected right there in the body, Hello World. So as I mentioned, there's no need to register components or services or anything like that when bootstrapping, so you just pretty straightforward. So routing. Let's take a look at routing. So you saw we have Hello World there as our root application. So let's take a look at what Hello World looks like. So we go into our app, components, and we go to Hello World. So here's the HTML. We have a header there where we have a top nav component where we're passing in a navline object into that component. We have a sidebar here, and we have a div where we have our router outlet, and that is the placeholder for the view that we want rendered when we go to different routes. So when we look at the actual component itself, again, not very big, not too much you have to write here. So first we bring in everything that we need. Angular 2, we're pulling in component bootstrap. We actually probably don't need bootstrap here, but we bring in router pieces that we need. We're bringing in our components that we're loading in this page, our top nav components, our sidebar component, dashboard and admin components for routing. So the routing itself, we configure with this @route config like decorator for our component. So we're saying that if you navigate to /dashboard, then you want to load the dashboard component. And if you're going to /admin, you want to load the admin component. In addition, you'll see here how we have to inject router directives. We have to specify that we need those, that we're using those directives in our hello world.html file. And that's how we can use the router outlet tag in there, that router outlet directive. So, and that's basic routing right there. It's that component tree. So app is just a component tree. This is the root component. So as you can see here, we're saying that this component has two child components, top nav component and sidebar component, that we're utilizing. And if we go back to the HTML, that's where we're using those two components, top nav and sidebar. Top nav, we're injecting navline, which you can see here, we're creating that in the constructor here, putting it right on our component class so it's available to use in our template. And there's the object that we're passing in. And also here we're saying that by default, navigate to dashboard when you load the app. So those components, let's take a look at some of these. Top nav and sidebar. Let's take a look at the top nav real quick. So we look in this one. This one doesn't have any child components itself, so that's a leaf on the tree. And pretty straightforward, just loads the top nav HTML. So a pretty simple one there. Now, when we're routing, we saw how you can go to dashboard or load admin. So let's take a look at dashboard. And this is a good example of that tree structure. So dashboard itself here, you can see it itself has its own child components, the container component, news component, and people component that are used in its template. Here we're injecting people service, which we're pulling out from services, which we'll take a quick look at that in a second. Using that to load the people data that we need from the server, and then make it available for the template. So our template here, we've got our containers here. We're using it twice. One of them for people, one of them for that, which as you can see refers to these two components on the page. And then we're transcluding into those components this people component and this news component. So taking a look at that, so we set this people and this news on the component class that they're available in the HTML here. So we touched on transclusion. So transclusion, if you're not familiar with the term, it's dynamically including one component inside of another. In Angular 1, it's called transclusion. You would use the transclude property on a directive. In Angular 2, the solution is based on web components. So you use an ng content tag where you want the content to render. So if we take a look at the container component, we'll see in the HTML that we have this ng content here. So what that means is when we pass in the people component or the news component from dashboard, it's going to render that component will render in that spot. So what you end up with is this wrapper around the component where we have the title. So if we look at the HTML, we can see how this border and the title here are all part of the container component, and then inside of it we're rendering people or we're rendering news. Now, one thing we're not demonstrating here, but one of the nice things about using content, so in Angular 1 you basically had your transclude property and then you said where you used ng transclude, I believe, to specify where you wanted to load, just like what we saw here. However, ng content is much more powerful. You can actually use a select attribute on the ng content tag and use CSS selectors to specify where you want a specific transcluded component to render. So for example, if we were to take a look at here, if we had ng content select equals dot first, and then we had a second ng content, let's say up here in the header, that was ng content select equals dot second or something like that, then in our dashboard we could actually specify in here, we could have people, we could give it a class of first and it would render where we had our first selector. And then we could have a second component in there that had a class of second that was maybe a span, we'll say, and it had the title in it, and that would render wherever we said we wanted to inject first. So you can see how this can be pretty powerful, where you can really have some nice flexible designs here and be able to inject multiple components in multiple places. And that's kind of what we wanted to cover here in our first steps into Angular 2. You can feel free to go take a look at that project. It is under BrieBug Consulting, Hello World Angular 2. There's instructions here on how to install it. And it's based on, actually I'm not really sure which version, but it's based on, like it uses a beta version of Angular 2. Sorry, an alpha version of Angular 2. So if you want to dive in deeper to Angular 2, since they do have weekly releases and there are new features and whatnot, it can be difficult to find up-to-date tutorials. Sometimes you'll find articles that tell you how to do something, and then you'll realize when you fail to implement it that, oh, they actually changed the way that gets implemented. So some good up-to-date resources. First is the angular.io site. This is pretty up-to-date. They're actually doing a good job of building out their documentation. So you can go in and take a look. You can see like the API preview, and you can actually go in and see all the different things. So Angular 2, you can see you got the router here. You want to see what the router directives look like, and they give you some example code and whatnot. So it's a pretty good resource. Another one is the actual repo itself. Take a look at the actual code. A good way to learn how to write Angular 2 code is to take a look at how they do it. How does Angular create its root components that it's providing out of the box? You can use that as a template for your own. And lastly, there's a very nice curated repo here called Angular 2-Education, and it has all kinds of articles, tutorials, example applications, books, tools, whatnot. And it's a really good place to go and find some pretty good content for learning Angular 2. That's all we've got for today. We'll follow up with some more presentations soon, diving deeper into Angular 2. We'll add some more features to this Hello World application and show you how they work. So thanks for joining us today.